Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're diving deep into Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rumelt.
Yeah, this one really shook up the way people think about strategy.
It definitely did. It's not your typical business book, full of vague advice and motivational slogans. Rumelt gets right to the heart of what makes a strategy good or bad.
He argues that a good strategy is like a kernel with three key components. First, you need a clear diagnosis of the problem. What are the real challenges you're facing? Second, a guiding policy, a set of principles that'll guide your actions.
So instead of just saying we need to increase sales, you'd figure out why sales are lagging and then come up with a guiding policy to address that specific issue.
Exactly. And the third component is a set of coherent actions. These are the specific steps you'll take to implement your guiding policy. Rumel emphasizes that these actions need to be coordinated and focused, not just a random collection of initiatives.
He really stresses that good strategy is about making tough choices, focusing your efforts on what truly matters.
He does. And he illustrates these principles with a wide range of fascinating examples, from military campaigns to business turnarounds to even personal decisions.
It's amazing how these concepts apply to so many different areas of life.
They do. So are you ready to dive into the first chapter?
Absolutely. Let's unpack it.
Chapter 1 is titled, Good Strategy is Unexpected, and it sets the stage for the entire book. Rumelt kicks things off by arguing that good strategy is often surprising, even counterintuitive. He contrasts this with bad strategy, which tends to be predictable, generic, and full of fluff.
He gives the example of Apple's turnaround under Steve Jobs in the late 1990s.
Right. When Jobs returned to Apple, the company was on the brink of collapse. Many expected him to launch a slew of new products to try to compete in every segment of the market.
It would have been the classic throw everything at the wall and see what sticks approach.
Exactly. But Jobs did something unexpected. He drastically simplified Apple's product line, focusing on just a handful of core products.
He was famous for saying no to a lot of ideas, even good ones.
He was. And this ruthless focus on simplicity was a key part of Apple's turnaround. It allowed them to streamline their operations, improve their products, and regain their competitive edge.
It's a great example of how a good strategy often involves doing less, not more.
It is, and it highlights the importance of clear thinking and making tough choices. Rumelt argues that bad strategy often stems from a reluctance to make those choices.
It's easier to just say yes to everything and hope for the best.
It is, but as Rumelt shows, that approach rarely leads to success. He also criticizes the overemphasis on setting ambitious goals without a clear plan for how to achieve them.
He calls these blue sky objectives.
Right. He argues that these vague aspirations are often more about PR than about actual strategy. A good strategy, he says, needs to be grounded in reality with a clear understanding of the challenges you're facing and a specific plan for how to overcome them.
He gives the example of a company that set a goal of becoming the leading provider of innovative solutions.
It sounds impressive, but what does it actually mean? How do you measure innovation? What specific actions will you take to become the leading provider? Without those details, it's just an empty slogan.
He calls it bad strategy because it doesn't actually guide decision-making or action.
Exactly. It's just a bunch of words designed to sound good but ultimately meaningless.
So in this first chapter, Rumelt sets the stage for the rest of the book by contrasting good strategy with bad strategy and emphasizing the importance of clear thinking, tough choices, and a focus on action.
He also introduces the idea that good strategy often involves identifying and exploiting unexpected opportunities.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, Discovering Power. What's the core idea here?
This chapter digs deeper into the mechanics of good strategy, exploring how it leverages power to achieve its objectives.
It uses the analogy of a lever and a fulcrum.
Exactly. Just like a lever can amplify force, a good strategy identifies key leverage points in a situation and focuses resources on those points to maximize impact.
He gives the example of Walmart's strategy of being a low-cost retailer.
Right. It's not just about offering low prices, it's about creating a whole system that drives down costs at every step of the process. Walmart was a pioneer in using technology, logistics, and supply chain management to achieve this.
So their low prices were the result of a carefully designed system, not just a random tactic.
Exactly. Rumelt calls this strategic coherence. He argues that a good strategy involves aligning all your actions and resources to create a unified and powerful force.
So it's not just about having a bunch of good ideas, it's about making sure all those ideas work together.
Precisely. He also discusses the importance of recognizing the interconnectedness of things. He points out that in any complex system, there are often unexpected connections and feedback loops that can either amplify or undermine your efforts.
You need to understand the whole system, not just the individual part.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this systems thinking is crucial for developing a strategy that is both effective and resilient.
This is reminding me of that famous passage where he talks about the importance of understanding proximate objectives.
Yes. He writes, a good proximate objective is like a hilltop that can be seen, a target that can be hit with resources at hand. It's one of those lines that really sticks with you.
It's so clear and insightful. He's basically saying that you need to break down your big, ambitious goals into smaller, more manageable steps.
Exactly. And each of those steps should move you closer to your ultimate objective. It's like climbing a mountain. You don't just try to leap to the summit in one go. You break it down into a series of smaller climbs, each one building on the previous one.
This concept of proximate objectives is so powerful because it helps you to stay focused, measure progress, and adapt your strategy as needed.
It does, and it's a great example of how Rumelt takes these complex ideas and makes them clear and actionable.
So in this second chapter, we see Rumelt digging deeper into the mechanics of good strategy, emphasizing the importance of leverage coherence and a deep understanding of the systems you're operating in.
He also introduces the concept of proximate objectives, which will play a key role throughout the rest of the book.
And I'm sure there are plenty more insights to come.
Welcome back to our deep dive into good strategy, bad strategy. We left off talking about proximate objectives and how key they are for actually achieving those big, ambitious goals.
Yeah, it's like that famous line from Rumelt. A good proximate objective is like a hilltop that can be seen, a target that can be hit with resources at hand.
Exactly. Now, in Chapter 3, Bad Strategy, Rumelt takes aim at all those things that kind of masquerade as strategy but really just lead us astray.
Okay, let's unpack this. What are some of those hallmarks of bad strategy?
One common culprit is what he calls fluff. This includes vague goals, motivational slogans, and just a general lack of specificity. It's like a company saying they want to be the best, but without defining what best even means or how they'll get there.
It sounds impressive on the surface, but doesn't actually give you anything concrete to work with.
Right. He also points out that bad strategy often comes from not making tough choices. Like, it's easier to say yes to every opportunity or try to please everybody, but that approach rarely works out.
Yeah, makes sense. He gives the example of a company that was trying to be all things to all people. They had a huge product line and a really complex organizational structure and just no clear focus.
Sounds like they were trying to boil the ocean.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it ultimately led to their downfall. Rumelt argues that a good strategy requires making choices about what to do and what not to do.
Absolutely. He also criticizes this overemphasis on leadership charisma as a substitute for sound strategy.
So you're saying just having a charismatic leader isn't enough.
Right. Inspirational leadership can be important, but it's not a replacement for clear thinking and a solid plan of action.
Right.
He gives an example of a CEO who was brilliant, great speaker and motivator, but he lacked that strategic discipline to make hard decisions and execute effectively.
So the company initially did well, but then what happened?
Yeah, they thrived at first, but ultimately floundered when they hit a rough patch in the market.
It's a reminder that style can only take you so far. You need substance too.
Absolutely. He also takes aim at the idea that just setting ambitious goals is enough to guarantee success.
He calls this the new thought fallacy, right?
Right. The idea that if you just think positive thoughts and visualize your goals, everything will magically fall into place. Rumelt argues that while positive thinking can be helpful, it can't replace a sound strategy that's grounded in reality.
Yeah, you gotta have a plan.
Exactly. He emphasizes that good strategy requires a clear-eyed assessment of the challenges you're up against, not just wishful thinking.
So this is where Chapter 4, Using Leverage, comes in. He digs deeper into how good strategy uses power to get things done.
Exactly. He uses the analogy of Archimedes and his famous quote, "Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world."
That's a powerful image.
It is. He's saying that a good strategy is like finding that perfect lever in fulcrum. It lets you achieve more with less effort.
He gives the example of Hannibal's victory over the Romans at the Battle of Cannae.
Right. Hannibal was totally outnumbered and outmatched, but he used his knowledge of Roman military tactics to his advantage. He lured them into a trap and won a decisive victory.
A classic example of using leverage to outsmart your opponent.
It is. Rumelt also talks about the importance of anticipating change and positioning yourself to benefit from it.
He calls this riding the wave.
Exactly. He uses the example of Cisco Systems, which became a tech giant by basically riding the wave of the internet. They didn't invent the internet, but they were really good at recognizing its potential and positioning themselves to capitalize on it.
So it's about being in the right place at the right time, but also having the foresight to recognize the opportunity.
Exactly. It's not just luck, it's about recognizing the patterns and trends and having the vision to act on them.
So in this chapter, Rumelt is really emphasizing leverage anticipation and understanding how to ride that wave of change.
He is. He also brings back the idea of proximate objectives, which we discussed earlier, and how they can help you break down complex goals into those smaller, manageable steps.
Okay, so this leads us to chapter 5, focus. I'm sensing a theme here.
You got it. In this chapter, Rumelt goes deep on the power of focus in developing a successful strategy. He argues that one of the most common mistakes is trying to do too many things at once.
It's like that old saying, jack of all trades, master of none.
Exactly. Rumelt argues that real success, lasting success, comes from doing a few things really well rather than trying to be everything to everyone.
He uses the example of Crown Cork and Seal. That company that really thrived by focusing on a niche market.
Right. They specialized in short runs and custom orders, which meant they weren't directly competing with the giants in the industry. They built their whole business around serving that niche, and it worked out really well for them.
It's a great example of how a laser focus can lead to big wins.
Absolutely. Rumel also discusses the challenges of growth and how it can sometimes actually work against focus.
Wait, so growth isn't always a good thing?
It can be, but it can also be a trap. Rumelt says companies need to be careful not to grow too fast or spread themselves too thin. Unfocused growth can lead to you diluting your resources and losing that competitive edge.
He gives the example of a software company that grew super fast through acquisitions, but then struggled to integrate all the different parts of the business.
Exactly. They ended up with this Frankenstein's monster of a company with no clear identity or direction.
So sometimes less is more.
That's a great takeaway. He also talks about the importance of knowing your core competencies and focusing on what you're really good at.
He calls this exploiting the asymmetry.
Right. It's about identifying what you do better than anyone else and then building your strategy around that strength. Don't try to be good at everything, just be great at what matters.
I like that. So in this chapter, Rumelt is really hitting hard on the power of focus, saying it's important to resist chasing after every shiny new opportunity that comes along.
And he highlights those challenges of growth and how it can lead to you losing that focus and ultimately losing your advantage.
Which brings us to chapter 6, chain link systems. What's the core idea here?
In this chapter, Rumelt explores the idea that a good strategy is like a chain made up of interconnected links.
So each link represents a crucial part of the strategy.
Exactly. And like a chain, the strategy is only as strong as its weakest link. So everything needs to be strong and well coordinated across all those different elements.
He uses the analogy of a military campaign where success depends on a whole series of actions happening in sync.
Exactly. You could have a brilliant plan, but if the logistics fail or communications break down, the whole thing falls apart.
It's about making sure all the pieces work together smoothly, like a well-oiled machine.
That's a great way to put it. He also talks about understanding the critical path in a chain link system.
Okay, what does he mean by critical path?
The critical path is the sequence of activities that determines how long a project will take. It's the longest path through the network of all those activities, and any delay on the critical path will delay the entire project.
Ah, so it's the bottleneck, the thing you really need to focus on.
You got it. Rumelt says that a good strategy identifies that critical path, and then you focus your energy and resources on those activities that are most likely to cause delays or problems.
Makes sense. He gives the example of a construction project where pouring the foundation is the critical path.
Right. If that foundation isn't poured on time, everything gets pushed back. So it's super important to make sure you have everything in place to make sure that happens on schedule.
That's a great way to visualize how to approach strategy.
It is. He also talks about the importance of slack in a chain link system.
Okay, what's slack?
Slack is the amount of time an activity can be delayed without impacting the whole project. Think of it like a buffer built into your schedule.
So it's like a safety net.
Exactly. Rumelt argues that a good strategy builds in some slack to account for unexpected things, delays or problems. It helps make your strategy more resilient and adaptable to change.
So it's about being prepared for the unexpected. Always a good idea. Anything else about chain link systems?
Yeah. He also discusses the importance of feedback loops in these systems.
What are feedback loops?
Feedback loops are mechanisms that allow information to flow back from the later stages of a process to the earlier stages. So you can use this feedback to make adjustments and improve the overall performance.
Oh, so it's like learning from your mistakes and making changes as you go.
Precisely. Rumelt argues that a good strategy includes feedback loops to make sure it's constantly evolving and improving. He gives the example of a manufacturing process where they use quality control checks to catch defects early on so they can be fixed before they become bigger issues.
It's about catching those problems before they snowball out of control.
Exactly. And that principle applies to strategy too. A good strategy is always being evaluated and adjusted based on new information and changing circumstances. It's a dynamic process.
And that brings us to Chapter 7, Using Dynamics. What's the focus here?
In this chapter, Rumelt explores how good strategy often involves using those dynamic forces in the environment to your advantage.
So it's not just about reacting to change, but about actively shaping and influencing it.
You got it. He argues that the most successful strategies are those that anticipate and harness those forces.
It's like that surfer analogy again.
Exactly. A skilled surfer doesn't just sit around and wait for a wave to come along. They paddle out to where the waves are breaking and then use their knowledge and skill to catch the best ones.
It's about being proactive and knowing when to strike. So how do you do that? How do you anticipate those changes?
Well, one thing he talks about is understanding the attractor state of a situation.
Attractor state, what's that?
An attractor state is a stable state that a system naturally tends to move towards over time, kind of like a valley in a landscape. Once you're in the valley, it's hard to get out.
So it's like a powerful force that shapes the direction things are going.
Exactly. Rumelt says a good strategy takes this attractor state into account. You either work with it or find ways to disrupt it.
He uses the example of the music industry and the shift from CDs to digital downloads.
Right. That move toward digital music was the attractor state, and the companies that resisted it really struggled.
So it's about understanding those bigger forces at play and adapting your strategy accordingly.
He also talks about recognizing impeded change.
Impeded change, what does that mean?
It's when change is necessary, but there are big obstacles in the way.
Like trying to steer a giant ship.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
takes a ton of effort and time to overcome the inertia of a big organization or a complex system.
He uses the healthcare industry as an example, which is facing a lot of challenges like rising costs and an aging population.
Right. But change in healthcare is often really slow and difficult. You've got regulations, entrenched interests, and just a general resistance to new ideas.
So it's about recognizing those obstacles and figuring out how to overcome them.
He also talks about the role of catalysts in driving change.
What are catalysts?
Catalysts are events or people that speed up the pace of change. They can be positive or negative, but they always have a big impact.
He gives the example of 9/11, which obviously had a huge impact on the airline industry and national security.
Right. Those events were catalysts that forced quick and dramatic changes in those areas.
So it's about recognizing those potential catalysts and using that knowledge to your advantage.
He also talks about exploiting the ecosystem.
Exploiting the ecosystem, what does that mean?
He's referring to the web of relationships and connections in any industry or market. A good strategy understands that ecosystem and finds ways to leverage it.
He gives the example of a company that developed a really successful strategy by partnering with other businesses.
Exactly. By working together, they were able to offer a better product and gain a competitive advantage.
So it's about recognizing that you're not alone and that you can often achieve more by collaborating. What else does he cover in this chapter?
We also talks about the importance of creating new resources.
So it's not just about using what you have, but about finding ways to create new resources.
Exactly. Rumelt argues that companies need to be constantly innovating and developing new capabilities if they want to stay ahead.
He gives the example of a company that created a new technology that allowed them to tap into a whole new market.
Right. They didn't just improve on an existing product, they created something entirely new, and that gave them a huge advantage.
So innovation is key. Makes sense.
It does. And that brings us to Chapter 8, Inertia and Entropy.
Oh boy, those don't sound like good things. What are the key insights in this chapter?
Well, in this chapter, Rumelt explores these powerful forces of inertia and entropy that can really hinder a company and make it hard to implement change.
Okay, break it down for me. What exactly does he mean by inertia?
Inertia is basically the tendency of organizations to resist change. Think of it like pushing a boulder up a hill. It takes a lot of effort to get it moving.
I get it. And he says this comes from things like ingrained routines, cultural norms, and people protecting their turf.
Exactly. And these forces can make it really hard for companies to adapt and seize new opportunities.
He gives the example of a company that was slow to embrace new technology because their employees were just too comfortable with the old ways of doing things.
Right. They were afraid of the disruption that new technology would bring, so they stuck with what they knew.
So their inertia held them back.
Exactly. He also talks about this concept of inertia by proxy.
Inertia by proxy. What's that?
It's when an organization's resistance to change is influenced by the resistance of its customers or other stakeholders.
So, like, if a company wants to change its pricing, but its customers are used to the old way of doing things.
Precisely. The customer's reluctance to change makes it harder for the company to implement a new strategy.
So it's not just internal forces, it can be external too.
Right. It's about understanding that whole ecosystem we were talking about earlier. Now, what about entropy? You asked about that too.
Yeah, that one doesn't sound good either.
We uses the concept of entropy from physics to describe the tendency of things to get more disorganized over time.
Kind of like a garden that slowly gets overgrown with weeds if you don't tend to it.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. In organizations, this can show up as a bunch of unnecessary rules, procedures, technical debt, basically a gradual decline in efficiency and quality.
So it's like a slow erosion of the organization's effectiveness.
Exactly. And Rumelt argues that this is natural, it's going to happen, but you can counter it with good management, keeping things simple and clear.
So how do you fight back against these forces of inertia and entropy?
Well, Rumelt says it takes strong leadership, a clear vision, and a willingness to challenge the way things are done.
So not just going with the flow, but actually shaking things up.
Right. He emphasizes the importance of always looking for ways to simplify things, streamline processes, and get rid of any unnecessary complexity.
It's about creating a culture that embraces change.
Exactly. Encouraging people to experiment, to come up with new ideas, and rewarding those who challenge the status quo.
So this chapter is a bit of a reality check. It reminds us that change can be tough and there will be resistance.
It is. But he also offers hope. He says inertia and entropy aren't unbeatable.
With the right mindset and a commitment to improvement, organizations can overcome these challenges and achieve real success. So what's next? Where does he go from here?
Well, chapter 11 gets really interesting. This is where he dives into the human side of strategy. Yeah, so we were talking about how Rumelt dives into that human element of strategy in chapter 11.
Okay, so what's the big idea here? How does human behavior play into strategy?
He's basically saying that strategy isn't just about numbers and cold, hard logic. You have to factor in psychology and emotions, too.
That makes sense. People aren't always rational.
Exactly. And he argues that good strategists understand that. They can understand and influence people's behavior, whether it's customers, competitors, or their own employees.
So how do they do that?
Well, he talks about cognitive biases, which are like mental shortcuts that can lead to bad decisions.
Yeah, those pesky biases. We all have them.
We do. He gives the example of confirmation bias, which is that tendency to look for information that supports what we already believe, even if that information isn't accurate.
Yeah, we like to be right, even when we're wrong.
Exactly. And Rumelt says good strategists know about these biases and try to avoid them.
So they're more objective in their thinking. What else?
He also talks about the importance of incentives and how they can be used to motivate people.
Right. Everyone responds to incentives.
Exactly. Like he gives the example of a company that was trying to boost sales, and they created an incentive program that rewarded salespeople for closing deals. And guess what?
Sales went up.
Sales went through the roof. It's a simple example, but it shows how powerful incentives can be.
It's not rocket science.
Yeah.
But it's easy to forget.
Absolutely. And then he talks about something called framing.
Framing, what's that?
It's about how you present information, how you frame a problem or an opportunity. He says that can really influence how people see it and how they react.
Oh, I see. Like spin?
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
He gives the example of a politician who is trying to get support for a policy, and he framed it in terms of the benefits to the community instead of focusing on the costs. And it worked. He got people on board.
That's smart. It's all about presentation.
It is. So in this chapter, Rumelt's really challenging us to think about strategy from a different angle, to consider not just the logic, but the psychology of it all.
That's fascinating. Okay, so where does he go from there?
Well, in chapter 19, The Science of Strategy, he explores this idea that strategy is not just an art, it's also a science.
So there's more to it than just intuition and gut feeling.
There is. He says there are underlying principles and frameworks that can help us understand and develop effective strategies. It's not just random.
Okay, so what are some of those principles?
Well, he talks about game theory, which is a branch of math that studies strategic decision-making.
Game theory. Sounds complicated.
It can be, but basically it's about understanding how your choices impact the choices of others, like anticipating your competitors' moves.
Oh, so it's like chess.
Exactly. You have to think several steps ahead. And Rumelt says game theory can be a really useful tool for understanding how competition works and making smart decisions.
Interesting. What else?
He also talks about the importance of experimentation, trying new things and seeing what works.
So you don't just come up with a plan and stick to it no matter what.
Right. It's about testing different approaches, gathering data, and making adjustments as you go.
So it's an ongoing process of learning and adapting.
Exactly. And finally, he talks about using data and analytics to make better decisions.
So backing up those gut feelings with hard evidence.
Right. We have so much data available now. And he says good strategists use that data to spot patterns, trends, and make smarter choices.
So strategy is a blend of art and science, intuition, and data.
It is. And I think that's a key takeaway from the book.
This has been a fantastic deep dive. Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rumelt is definitely a book worth reading. It's full of insights and practical advice.
I agree. It challenges you to think differently about strategy and gives you a framework for developing your own strategic skills.
If you're looking to up your game, whether you're running a company or just trying to make better decisions in your life, this book is for you. And remember, good strategy is often unexpected. Until next time, happy strategizing.